The Corsair 4000D Airflow. It's the higher ventilated version of the Corsair 4000D by way of a perforated front panel. Costs around £80, dollars or euros, and Corsair sent it over to me for review. So without further ado, you know the drill, let's get into it. There's not much special in the packaging and unboxing department, small amount of play in the polystyrene molds, but otherwise pretty standard. Apart from these lengths of tape that are ensuring the front panel and top filter don't detach during transit. I most notably found this was a problem with the Q300L previously, and in a case of this price it's worth having. Moving on to the exterior, up front we've got a clean steel panel with a perforated geometric pattern which features 4 ball and socket connectors for super fast removal. The ball and socket connection works really well here since the side intake slots also provide good clearance to grip the panel, but somewhere they don't work so well are on the side panels. One of the sides has a glass panel and the other has plain steel, both with rear fixings to minimize visual clutter where it matters, and both feature the same ball and socket connectors as the front panel, only this time each having 2 to the rear. Why don't they work so well here? Well, unlike the front panel, which gives you plenty to grip onto thanks to the side intake slots, the side panels have 2 rear tabs that are barely the width of my thumb. Yes, I have chunky thumbs, but even these beasts struggle to hold onto a 4mm thick glass side panel by the size of these 2 tabs without hitting the deck when it pops off. Now, before I get carried away, the idea is that the front leading edge is supported by a variation of the standard slot and hook style connection, and the rear is both supported and secured by the ball and socket connection, like the front panel. The side panels can actually be secured purely by these ball and socket connections without the need for the rear thumb screws, which also means they're pretty tough cookies. And by the time you've built up enough force to break the connection, the panel is kind of out of control. This doesn't work so well if, like me, initially you're trying to be gentle, not to damage or drop it by yanking it off, but actually being more aggressive works in your favor since you're controlling the wild movement and you're ready for it. But just make sure you're keeping an eye on the front since it sits on thin ice. Long story short, they're not great if you're gentle and precarious, and they're good if you're more aggressive, but there's not a lot to grip onto in the back, so you're gonna get your greasy paws all over the glass at the front every time you take it off. Moving on, up top we have our front I/O, which features reset and power buttons, a combined mic and headphone jack, and USB 3.1 Type-C and USB 3.0 Type-A ports, a very up-to-date spread of connections. And just behind is the top filter, but we'll get onto more of that stuff in a second. To the rear we've got a mostly standard layout with a bottom ATX power supply unit position, upper 120mm fan and rear I/O position, and a central horizontal PCI Express slot zone with an additional 2 vertical PCI Express slots for those of you who are into water cooling or sexy air-cooled graphics cards that run a little toasty. Rounding off the exterior, the base has 4 30mm tall feet with grippy rubber pads and an early look at the underside of the drive cage slot mechanism that is, and an eyeful of the power supply unit intake filter, which works very fluidly thanks to the tapered side rails and tall feet. So that's the exterior dealt with. How about we cover the insides? Let's kick off with the fans, filters, and radiator support. It wouldn't be a proper AV Techie review without compatibility slides. So starting with the fans, we've got support for 3 120s and 2 140s up front. Up top you can go for a couple 120s or 140s, and to the rear you've got a space for a single 120mm fan with no support for fans in the base, which wouldn't be particularly useful in this case anyway. You get a couple of 120mm fans with the case. They're basic 3-pin fans, so it's nothing to write home about, but don't feel the need to swap these out for 12 8,000 RPM fans at the cost of $20 each, since these things are reasonably quiet and will perform well enough for low and mid power systems without any issues, even some high power systems depending on the coolers you have. For those that typically ask, if the manufacturer isn't bragging about the fans on their website, they're basic fans that they don't sell individually, so if you don't see a sticker in a video and it hasn't been specifically mentioned what fans they are, that's how you find your answer. Check the website. Corsair are happy enough to highlight these on their website, but a simple search indicates they don't sell them individually. In terms of filters, we've already covered the power supply unit, but we only touched on the top filter, which is your typical magnetic strip mesh secured filter. Only this one has a silicone tab to the rear to make the process of removing the filter easier? Yeah, I don't think it's necessary from a usability standpoint, so I'll have to put this one down to a visual design decision that looks okay, but it's a little out of place on an otherwise clean exterior. The front filter is different in a better way though. After removing the front panel, the filter can be removed by lightly pulling on the top tab. It takes very little effort since it's only secured by 4 small magnets and a couple of lower tabs, and combined with the 2-second front panel removal, this is about as easy as it gets to clean out a front filter and access the front panels. Well, unless you get a case with a front metal panel that is a filter, that is. How about radiators? Well, it's pretty much a reflection of the fans. So you've got support for a 360 or 280mm radiator up front, 240 or 280 up top, and a 120mm radiator to the rear. But keep an eye on the clearance measurements for the front, depth being dependent on the drive cage, and depth clearance notes to the top, which Corsair have at least provided a rough idea of what you can use relative to their own lineup of RAM modules. Like fans, there isn't support for radiators to the base of the case, but swiftly moving on to drives, there is support for a couple of those. But you'll need to go round to the rear of the motherboard tray to grab the 2.5-inch drive sleds to do so. You get 2 drive sleds with the case, and there are 4 positions for these sleds. You can buy more if you want. They're the Obsidian 500D SSD brackets and cost $4, £5 or €5 each. You can even buy, in air quotes, a motherboard accessory tray to go behind your motherboard tray, which looks like it'll hold another couple of 2.5-inch drives. But I can't find anywhere that sells the thing, let alone find a price, so I'm discounting it kind of as an option at this stage. I'll quickly say the same about the power supply unit cover plate, which after going on the website turns into a power supply unit shroud cover plate, which makes more sense, but still isn't available. Anyway, 3.5-inch drive wise, there are 2 3.5-inch drive sleds that can take 2.5-inch drives as well. The sleds themselves are the awkward plastic kind that require bending to accept a drive, but it's a one-time operation, so it's tough to be too irritated at. All of this gives you a few options: stock with a couple of 3.5-inch drives and 2.5-inch drives, 4 2.5-inch drives, or the upgrade option for less than $10 to give you an extra couple 2.5-inch drive sleds, which probably won't be required by most. The 3.5-inch drive cage itself has a couple of positions it can sit in, front or back. This gives you a little more space to the front or rear depending on the radiator or power supply unit choices you make. Check out these slides for all the clearance measurements you require. You can also remove the drive cage entirely if you don't need it, or to give you a little bit more space for installing the power supply unit. Power supply unit clearance is generous with a minimum of 202mm of space measured from the rear to the tip of the drive cage screw tabs. Just bear in mind this is clearance we're talking about, so give yourself a good 20mm of space for cables. More if you want an easier time of cable managing. I've got a thing for cable management before installing the motherboard and graphics card, basically getting everything ready while the case is clear of the big stuff that's harder to shift around. This can be really important for cases with lacking cable management, especially in areas like the CPU power connector, where in some cases the motherboard will partially cover the provided holes, but in this case there aren't any issues like that. That particular issue is avoided by the fold in the top of the motherboard tray and the 3D cutout for the hole. I say 3D cut because I can't think of a better way of describing it. We've also got cable management loops all over the place, which are just about big enough to take a 10mm wide Velcro strap, and there's this plastic channel with a few installed thick Velcro straps. It can be removed with a couple of screws, even the top curved piece can be individually removed, and the Velcro straps can be taken out, flipped around, or replaced with a few extra ones you get in the parts box, which we'll cover more in a second. It's quite robust and useful, but for me, I find using thinner Velcro straps with cable management loops easier since they're simpler and faster to undo and restrap, and do just as good a job with less bulk. But I'll grant they don't look as nice. However, I think not looking so tidy to the rear isn't that big of an issue thanks to this panel that covers the larger central holes in the main compartment. By default, it's in the ATX position, but can be moved slightly to the right, or left if you're looking from the back, to make way for an eATX board up to 305 by 277mm. Anyway, all of that is to say cable management on offer is excellent, and I'd say it's above average at this price point. Quickly touching on the parts box and manual, there never seems to be a smooth time to get into this. You get a pile of resealable bags with all the various screws you'll need for the case, as well as a load of zip ties, some washers, which I'm really not sure about, and the additional Velcro straps mentioned earlier, which kind of confused me since I don't know where else to put them. There's nothing mentioning the washers or straps in the manual. Speaking of which, it's quite a thick document, but it's 10 pages per language, 10 languages in total, for a total of 110 pages, plus a bit to the front and back. The diagrams are relatively clear and uncluttered, but again, there's no explanation for the extra Velcro straps and washers. They're just Velcro straps and washers, so I can only assume the straps are replacements and the washers have something to do with potential radiator installations or something. Anyway, you know you're on something when you start boring yourself. Moving on to the motherboard stuff, there's not a huge amount to comment on here. There's nothing to get caught on, so installing the motherboard is simple. I'm using a micro ATX board as it's part of my test system and has a socket in the same place as an ATX board, only it's compatible with more cases. Since the cutouts for the base for the cable management are into the shroud and not the wall, they're well clear of becoming a contentious issue for ATX or eATX boards. The extra large standoff post is even more effective than your standard one since it drops the screw-in feature and opts to be an even better guide standing proud of the board. I prefer this kind of standoff post as it makes installing motherboards even easier than standard standoff posts, and there's no need to have an extra screw in here when there's 8 surrounding it, each with threading that will probably provide enough force to crush your hand with your little finger. I'm getting off topic again. The CPU cooler clearance sits at 170mm, the Scythe Mugen 5 here standing at 155mm tall, and the graphics card installation can go in a couple of different directions as mentioned earlier. You could vertically mount it if you're water cooling, or like seeing numbers between 80 and 100, or 37, or for all you air coolers that like lower numbers, which is most of us, you can horizontally mount your card. I've said it before and I'll say it again, if a screw isn't intended to be used with your fingers, don't make it a heavy knurled one. Once a card is in place, you'll have to use a screwdriver, and at that point, a heavy knurled screw just becomes a pain in the ass when it falls off because it's too heavy for the magnetism of your screwdriver, and even worse for unmagnetized screwdrivers. So that's the GPU installation covered and everything this case has to offer, so let's talk performance. Testing involves 3 setups: stock max, which will run the stock fans, in this case one 120mm intake to the front and one 120mm exhaust to the rear at full speed to determine the maximum cooling performance with this test system and the maximum noise output of the stock case. The second setup, called optimal acoustic, replaces all the stock fans with my test fans, and they're all limited to produce a total system noise output of 36.5 dBA at 40 centimeters from the front of the case at a 45-degree angle. It's also worth noting the CPU cooler and graphics card remain at the same speed throughout all testing. It's 1350 RPM on the graphics card and it's 1080 RPM on the CPU cooler, if memory serves me well. For this case, we're replacing those stock fans with 3 front intakes, 1 top exhaust and 1 rear exhaust for a total of 5 fans. This determines the noise normalized performance of the case itself outside of the performance determined by the stock fans. And finally, the third setup, optimal max. This takes all the fans from the second setup and ramps them up to full speed to see just how loud this case can be and how cool the test system could possibly run based on the case fan support available. Someone questioned why I run fans at full speed for stock testing and told me I should look into running them at a more realistic speed, such as 50%. It's worth clarifying to everyone looking to take these test results seriously that running them at 50%, 60%, 100% or any fixed percentage speed is arbitrary, since we're talking relative performance between cases and fixed system settings. Whether the fan is running a more realistic speed doesn't impact the performance difference between the cases, and nobody should be taking these results as thermal or acoustic performance guidance. It's all relative to the results on the graphs and this test system only. The only thing you can determine from these results is which of these cases I've tested performs better than the others in certain ways. Anyway, with all that covered, let's get into results and the analysis. We've got a couple of tests to run through: a high-low test with Priority 5 and Furmark for 10 minutes, and a gaming test with the Firestrike combined test looping for 10 minutes. The stock setup with Priority 5 and Furmark has the 4000D airflow performing in the lower half of the cases I've tested, at least when sorting by GPU thermals. In terms of CPU thermal performance, it's pretty much tied best with the LAN-Cool 2 mesh, well, just behind it. It's also worth noting, and I have mentioned this in the last few case reviews, but most of these cases, or all of these on this page actually, are high airflow cases, so compared to a closed front case, all of these should compare very favorably in terms of thermal performance, at least anyway. But the stock setup has 2 sides to it. There's thermal performance, which you've just seen, and the acoustic performance. So swapping over to the fan, noise, and case volume stats, you can see the 4000D airflow is by a hair the third quietest of the bunch in the light blue bars, which makes the 4000D airflow the third hottest by GPU thermals and third quietest, which is at least poetic, if not a fair explanation of the thermal performance, but it starts to sound really good when considering it's the second coolest in the CPU thermals and third quietest. Moving on to the Firestrike test, there was a minor swap between the 4000D Airflow and the TD500 Mesh, but otherwise it's all the same. The 4000D Airflow is still performing extremely well regarding CPU thermals and good in GPU thermals, as well as being a relatively quiet case at full speed on the stock case fans. How about the case itself though? How does it perform when all the stock fans are gone and they're replaced with the same fans in the same positions as all the other cases, and the fans are tuned to output the same noise level? Well, for Priority 5 and Furmark, this is what we get, and we can tell that the 4000D Airflow has pretty low airflow resistance, but it's nothing crazy compared to the TD500 Mesh, Aero 1 without its filter, and Signum SG1 Evo TG ARGB. These are all high airflow cases after all. I think the only major distinction between the 4000D Airflow and the Lancool 2 Mesh is the filter. The Lancool 2 Mesh opts for using the front steel panel with perforations across most of its width, which would appear to have higher airflow than the smaller traditional mesh filter on the 4000D Airflow, but I'd hazard a guess that the 4000D Airflow will be better at handling dust than the Lancool 2 Mesh, so I think we're looking at a classic trade-off between dust management and airflow here, which would explain the result. It's probably also worth noting the Lancool 2 Mesh is a significantly larger case, which speaks for the higher airflow, but both it and the 4000D Airflow have all the case fans set to 30%, albeit the average fan speed was a little lower in the Lancool 2 Mesh, but both were outputting 36.5 dBA. The fans at this speed are really at the edge of stalling. Some of these cases needed to drop the speed down to 27%, which is as low as I can reliably drop them before they start stalling. Next test setup, I think I'm gonna opt for a higher noise target or 1200 RPM fans to give me more room to play with, the current ones being 2200 RPM fans. Switching over to Firestrike, there's a bit of a shuffle around of the scores. The 4000D Airflow is still in the upper half of the pack, but the no filter Aero 1 has jumped ahead, which is kind of cheating since there's no attempt to filter the system in that setup, or it makes the 4000D Airflow look good considering it's just behind and has a good filter. And last but not least, it's the Optimal Max setup, where we ramp all the case fans up to full speed. With Priority 5 and Furmark, the 4000D Airflow doesn't improve drastically compared to the stock max testing. It only dropped 5 degrees Celsius on the GPU temperature and increased in noise level by 12 dBA, whereas the Lancool 2 Mesh dropped 5.5 degrees, half a degree more, it's within tolerance I guess, and increases in noise level by only 10 dBA, not 12. Out of all these cases, the 4000D Airflow deals with brute force airflow worse than most on this list, but it isn't the worst of the bunch, and brute force airflow is likely only relevant to a handful of people for a minimal portion of the time, so it's not a massive deal, at least I don't think so. And just to round off the testing, the Firestrike testing for the Optimal Max setup weirdly sees the 4000D Airflow drop a fair few places regarding GPU thermals. I say weirdly since it didn't do this in the stock max testing and hasn't behaved like this in any of the other tests, but it's still doing a good job on the CPU front compared to all the other cases anyway, so not so bad. So that's the testing analysis covered. Now for the cost and value aspects. Based on PC part picker pricing, you can generally pick up the 4000D Airflow for £80, euros, or dollars. So when we take that and combine it with the optimal acoustic Firestrike performance data, you can see the 4000D Airflow is a better value option than the Lancool 2 Mesh and TD500 Mesh. But ultimately that's not very surprising considering the cost of both of those cases. In reality, price has a much higher driving force on the price versus performance formula, and you'll only notice differences when either the prices are very different as they are here, or the performance is very different when the prices are very similar. Depending on the price you can get it for, you could also consider the MB311L or AeroCool Aero 1, strictly speaking on the price versus performance front. So let's form a conclusion to this. If we're talking around the $80, pounds or euros price mark, it's between this, the MB311L and Aero 1, each having unique features. So for a quality ATX case that's visually clean, I'd choose a 4000D Airflow. For a quality micro ATX case with some ARGB elements, you should look towards the MB311L ARGB, and if you want the unique look of the Aero 1 with some ARGB elements, then that's an option, but the build quality isn't as high on that one, and you get proprietary fans, so depending on what you have planned, that could cause an issue. Otherwise, from what I've worked with, you can pay less for lesser build quality but good features, which is a good way to go, or pay more for higher build quality with different or more features. The LAN Cool 2 Mesh being a great example of stellar build quality and excellent drive storage capacity, but it'll cost you an extra 20 or 40 of your region's currency, depending on where you buy it and what price you get it for. But you could get close to that kind of storage capacity with the 4000D Airflow if you get yourself the extra drive sleds and or that motherboard rear plate, which may give you better value if you can get your hands on it. I think the 4000D Airflow trades a little regarding the amount of fans provided for nicer construction quality, but that doesn't appear to take away from it regarding film performance, at least with a test system that I have here. It's got everything I look for and would recommend in a case, so it gets a recommendation from me. If you like this review and want to check out more like the Lian Li LAN Cool 2 Mesh, TD500 Mesh and MB311L ARGB, look no further than the top right hand corner or to the side somewhere in a second. Consider subscribing for more if you really like the content, and if you really want to go above and beyond, you can support the channel on Patreon, which is a good opportunity to thank those of you who continue to support me on Patreon, and you can use the Amazon associate link in the video description to pick up the 4000D Airflow and anything else, which will provide a small commission to the channel. It's probably worth mentioning that we just reached 10,000 subscribers, which has been a bit of a slog over the last year, but it's 2021 and I'm all in to expand the channel faster than ever before. So stay tuned, thanks for the support, and I'll see you next time.